Tonight, however, we present the Spanish influenza in Newfoundland and Labrador, 1918 to 1919, through the eyes of a medical doctor who is also a medical and military historian, a nursing historian and neophyte filmmaker, and a veteran social historian. This session will focus on the island of Newfoundland, and Budgell will, sometime in 2021, present the situation for Labrador based on her wonderful book, We All Expected to Die, Spanish Influenza in Labrador, 1918 to 1919, and her continuing research on that subject. The first speaker will be Dr. Ian Parsons, a graduate specialist in family medicine with particular experience in Northern Canada and rural Newfoundland. And he is an associate professor of Memorial University's medical faculty. He inherited his father's, Dr. David Parsons' interest in medical and World War I history. His other professional training and experience are with sports medicine and the medical staff for Canada's Paralympic teams. Dr. Heidi Coombs is a program evaluation specialist with the Faculty of Medicine and a historian specializing in Grenfell Mission nursing in Labrador and Northern Newfoundland. She is currently involved in postdoctoral research on the Grenfell Mission and the Inuit of Nunatuavut in Southern and Central Labrador. She is also our fearless leader as president of this historical society. And I was surprised to learn yesterday she is also an emerging documentary filmmaker. Dr. Terry Bishop Sterling next year will be a 40-year veteran Memorial University history professor, and she has the war wounds and the medals to prove it. She recently finished a 4-year stint as head of the department. Her work in social and political history focuses on health, welfare, volunteer, and women's issues. She is a longtime member of the board of this society and is a past president. So let the games begin. This panel will speak in the order I have introduced them. Ian will begin, followed by Heidi and then Terry. A question and comment period will follow, and each of you are then invited to enjoy anything from quail on toast to pork and duff or whatever suits your taste in the comforts of your own homes. So I call on Ian to speak first. And I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, host disabled, screen sharing. Heidi, could you share the screen there? Or allow me to share?
Can you share there now, Ian?
Yep. Okay. So, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to my co-presenters, Heidi and Terry. I'll try and not go over time. It's one of my faults. So I'll say that up front. And as was said, Ann Budgell will be speaking later in the year about the devastation of influenza in Labrador, although I will make just a side note of Private Edward Smith in Battle Harbour, who is a Commonwealth War Graves casualty of influenza who was buried in Battle Harbour. As well, I just like, given the news this week, I would also just like to thank those individuals involved with the research work done in finding the family of Private John Lambert, who a Newfoundlander killed near Ypres, whose remains were found, and through diligent research here in Newfoundland, his family has been found, and he will be reburied in Belgium. And a lot of this, some of this work was in fact came from a paper my father did in the Spanish Lady in Newfoundland Regiment many, many years ago, but it's been updated. So it's interesting from a military point of view that in Nicholson, the history of the Newfoundland Regiment, there's actually no mention of influenza. And you'll see throughout this talk, there are some of the blue inserts. The blue inserts indicate there's some relationship to COVID, and I'll try and create those parallels. So these were the symptoms the influenza committee of the British Army found in 1918. And if you look down through them and go through the COVID screen that many of you may have done over the last 6 or 7 months, they're very similar. Influenza and COVID they are not the same disease, and I'll say that from the outset. They are not the same. An influenza virus and COVID or coronavirus are different, yet there are similarities that create the events that have happened throughout the pandemic. This is just showing the characteristics, and the red arrows, big chart, but look at the red arrows. So the R number, or transmissibility, is short for the number of people you're likely to infect. SARS-CoV-2 has a higher infectivity number than does pandemic flu of 1918, and the incubation period may in fact be longer. Pandemic flu is a shorter incubation period, so there's a longer term for asymptomatic people to infect people, which creates a bit of a problem. Quarantine time presently for COVID is 14 days, whereas for influenza is anywhere from 5 to 9 days. And of course, the influenza epidemic we had in 2009, another H1N1 variety, same as the Spanish flu, probably has more closer correlates, but as I said, COVID as a pandemic has many correlates. So it's always asked, what were the origins of the Spanish flu? And a number of hypotheses have been put forward. Mark Humphreys, formerly from Memorial, talked about it being from China, came across with the Chinese labor corps that were brought across Canada and sent to the Western Front. But that's not been proven conclusively by tissue diagnosis because there hadn't been any samples from the 1917 flu in China. Another version is started in Mexico and came up in the skirmishes between the American and the Mexican army in 1917. But these are all hypotheses and none has been proved. The classic was always that it started in, or most widely reported early on in Camp Funston in Kansas in the US, but it's probably originated elsewhere. But that's where it got the first notice. And of course, Spanish flu, similar to the present pandemic, Spanish flu really wasn't Spanish, but the Spaniards were neutral and hence their press was not censored. Countries at war did not want to give anything away, and hence Spain being more open about their news outlets, they got blamed with it. I would say there's a similar parallel with Trump and his Chinese flu. And so prejudice and racism about the start of these things hasn't changed in 102 years. The second wave continued on. You can see there that a lot came back from Europe, brought back by the troops back to the United States, spread throughout Russia, and in fact, with the Bolsheviks in northern Russia in the Siberian expedition, there was spread. You can see then that the major ports, Boston from the States, Plymouth is across from Brest in France, and Freetown, Sierra Leone, which was when you went on the outer coast of Africa, down around the Horn of South Africa, that's where the ships would stop for recoaling, and hence that's what, there was a hotbed of Spanish flu then. You can see, interestingly, a Newfoundlander by the name of, in the medical corps, Dr. John Matthew Monroe, who was originally a Presbyterian missionary. He joined, after finishing med school in 1918, joined the Canadian Army Medical Corps and was assigned, actually, because it was late in the war, to the Canadian Siberian expedition. And he was sent to Vancouver to Vladivostok. And he developed influenza on the way from Vancouver to Vladivostok in October of 1918, fortunately surviving. This is one of the saddest stories in the Newfoundland Regiment. Private Joseph Alexander from Mattis Point, age 22. He enlisted October 14th, 1918, and he died at the General Hospital on the 20th of October, 1918. His service was 6 days. He was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in St. John's, and his family were given the memorial scroll and plaque. And you'll see that basically with the Newfoundland Regiment, much of the effect on the regiment was in fact at home in Newfoundland, and many of them were the new recruits or the so-called conscripted recruits of 1918, and they all have high numbers, mostly in the mid 5,000s and 6,000, given that the Newfoundland Regiment numbers went up to just over 6,300. You can see this famous portrait by Sir Luke Fields, about 1891, trying to wait for the crisis of pneumonia to pass. And you can see that in 1918, physicians, this was a clinical diagnosis. There wasn't a lot in the way of x-rays, so all diagnoses were clinical. In 2020, part of the diagnosis is obviously laboratory. Everyone gets swabs, the nasopharyngeal swabs, there's viral testing, readily access to x-rays and CT scans. None of this was available in 1918 except for the occasional x-ray, and certainly none in the field. It was all a clinical diagnosis, and much of what was defined as pneumonia at that time was probably pneumonia secondary to influenza. You can see here the deaths from the 3 waves of pandemic, and in Britain, July 1918 was the first wave, which lots of infection but relatively few deaths. And you can see the death rates being much higher in October, November, and then the 3rd wave in the spring. And although I realize it's not the chart for deaths, this is the cases in Canada, you can see a parallel in the small jump in the July of 1918, flattening out then throughout the summer, and then rising up to November 2020, and who knows what's in store in December and further on. And the interesting thing is that we never know what's going to be the next. We don't know how many waves there are going to be of the COVID virus and how successful the vaccine is there until we're looking in retrospect. So you do have to remember we're looking at COVID in the middle and prospective, whereas the Spanish flu we're looking at retrospectively. You can see here the regular influenza tended to affect the young, and at that time, and I have to say that getting close to that 65 range there that starts to increase upwards, regular flu was young and old. The Spanish flu, and in 2009, the H1N1, young and old are still affected, but there's this middle group that have been affected. And hence the soldiers and military personnel at that time were heavily affected by that change in pattern. Some people feel it's because the last great influenza epidemic in the world had been around 1890. So some of the older people actually had some immunity to it, possibly. The younger people in their 20s, the war was just coming up to being 28 years after that, so they may not have had any immunity whatsoever. And the COVID-19, it's initially mostly the older folks over 65, and I say that being close to that, but the demographics are evolving because the number of people affected now in that 30 and 40 year age range is increasing, and the deaths in that 30 and 40 year age range are increasing, particularly in the States. And these are just some general military statistics to give you an idea of the scope of the Spanish flu. So if you look at just localized, and this is not overall, but just localized in the fall of 1918, the British Army had about 62,000 cases and 3,600 deaths. There was some thought that the Tommies, the British soldiers who'd been in the trenches in the summer, may have had the milder version of the flu and had some immunity to it. So they were not affected as badly as perhaps other forces, like the Americans. The Americans in the fall, with 1/3 of the number of British forces in Europe, had 113,000 cases with 9,000 deaths. And part of this may have been there was not as many Americans in the field in the summer of 1918, but you can see the COVID parallels. The Americans are affected much greater for entirely different reasons, but to a much greater degree than the British Army, and certainly the Canadian Army, which only had 776 deaths in 1 month in the fall. Overall, the German Army had, throughout the fall and summer, had about 170,000 deaths, including in the next spring. So the numbers are not quite comparable. And the Newfoundland Regiment in the fall of 1918 had approximately 351 cases with 29 deaths. That's just in the regiment. I commend the Commonwealth War Graves website to you. They have a little webinar, so to speak, regarding Spanish flu, and it's a very good website to go to. It includes a little bit on Bertha Bartlett, and the yellow areas show the great involvement of the influenza. So I just commend that to you for a future look. So this is a Newfoundlander, Private Robert Wooden, who signed up with the Canadian Forces while working in Halifax. He was from Grand Bank, and he sustained a gunshot wound to his head in August of 1918, sent back to England, and was convalescing. He was cleared from the convalescent hospital at the end of September and was rehabilitating. And you can see in the lower corner there his fever chart. You can see 104, 105. And I'm just going to give you a quick description. Bramshott Military Hospital, October 25th, 1918. Patient complains of headache, backache, soreness in chest, and cough. Illness began October 23rd, 1918. Face flushed but dusky, tongue very dry and coated, considerable cough. Rising very little sputum, the lungs show feeble breath sounds and crackles throughout. He was given anti-streptolysin serum in case it was strep, because they had no antibiotics. October 26, 1918, in hospital, very little change. October 27th, 1918, condition, not so good. Temperature 105 last night and irrational. October 28th, 1918, condition very bad, delusional last night, died at 10:55 p.m. So he passed away after a relatively short period of illness, and is buried in England, buried at Bramshott St. Mary's Churchyard, near where many other Newfoundlanders and many Canadians are buried, next to the hospital that served the Canadian camp. This is some combination work done by, whoops, hang on, sorry about that. So you can see it's a rough estimate, and this is hard to get the details of. Some of the information is from my father, who had access to the DVA files, and otherwise you're looking at individual files. So roughly speaking, you can see the cases in France in the fall, in the United Kingdom. These are in Newfoundland and Labrador, and these are cases they had on the transports on the way home. There's roughly about 351. There's 26 to 27 that actually died from flu in the regiment. And if you add in the ones that are also listed as dying of pneumonia, you can increase that as well. The other ones that have added in are POWs, VA nurses, Air Force. Measles was an issue, and part of the problem in the summer of 1918 in St. John's is that there were a number of deaths from influenza, but it wasn't considered a big deal because there was a fair number of deaths from measles as well. So it tended to skew people's perception of what the big problem was. And there's a couple of forestry who died as well. And here you can see the barracks at Prince's Rink in St. John's in 1918. So one of the problems, similar to today, is overcrowding. Everyone in the housing, lots of people together. So, just a second now. Okay, there we go. So if you think of ship transports going to Europe, think of planes flying around with COVID. So here's Private Charles McCarthy, who died on October 7th. He was with a draft that had left St. John's on September 22nd. They went to Halifax and then Quebec. On September, they left Quebec on the HM Her Majesty's Transport Hunsend and arrived at Davenport approximately 15 days later. There were about 650 soldiers on board. 35 soldiers died en route. There were 13 cases of influenza with the Newfoundlanders. 3 died en route and are therefore buried at sea, and 6 died on arrival in England. Captain Nuns at that time commended Sergeant Arthur Hammond, who had a gallantry award winner for the Newfoundland Regiment, who was going back, having had Blue Petit leave. He was going back and he did yeoman service treating the influenza victims on the ship. He later lived in Corner Brook and worked at the mill there. And one of the things that probably saved the Canadians had made a policy since 1916 that when they sent transports over, those soldiers would be isolated in a camp for a month before they were allowed to train with the other soldiers. And this may very well have saved them the larger numbers that ran into problems that the other armies had. You can see there a picture taken from the CWGC website. It talks about the cyanosis, the blue dusky cyanosis, which was called heliotrope cyanosis, as a classic sign of influenza. And here's another temperature chart taken from a file of Private Butcher in Devonport. These, again, they traveled on the HMT Hunsend, and you can notice all their high numbers. These were all cousins from Mussel Harbour Arm in Placentia Bay. Charles Butcher was treated for influenza, and his cousins, John Butcher, who died at sea and was buried at sea en route, and his other cousin, William Butcher, who survived and actually trained in Winchester. And you can find that on their files. Not all files will have a temperature chart, but sometimes you get lucky with information like that. This is a tragedy of a veteran. As far as we can find out, there are 2 veterans who are still serving. So in other words, Blue Petits with low numbers who died of influenza. Sergeant Edward Joy, military medal in Bar, had been in Gallipoli, Beaumont-Hamel, Guadalcanal, Monchy, and Cambrai. And most of those, or all those, are battle honors of the regiment. He went home on Blue Petit leave. He returned to England, sorry, it should be the HMT Hunsend on draft 24, caught influenza on the trip, and he died in Devonport, England, of influenza and pneumonia, and is buried in the Efford Cemetery in Plymouth. It affected other Newfoundlanders who were in Europe. Corporal George Gowdy had been captured, I believe, in Monchy, and he'd had some initial problems, so he was kept in one of the camps, and through one of the trade agreements, he was kept in a prisoner of war camp in neutral Switzerland. The same thing people had in Holland as well. He was doing fairly well. As you can see, he was on the rowing squad in July of 1918. He caught influenza in the fall and died November 6, 1918. And the red area marks his original wooden cross, which has now been converted to a Commonwealth War Graves cross. Grippe was influenza, and you can see this on the German memorial. It affected them just as much. And the question really is Did it affect the German nation as much as the blockades? So it affected their ability to respond to the Allied effort in the last 100 days, and that's never really been answered. This is a hospital report from the government, and you can see the barrack sick parade. May and June it increased. Some of that is influenza, some is measles, decreases over the summer and increases in October. And you can see the hospital admissions in St. John's. These are the various hospitals where military personnel went. And you can see September, there were 67 people in hospital, 242 soldiers in hospital in October, and 129. And there's the military infectious disease hospital at 3 Military Road. Some people may have had coffee there in recent years, but at one time it was a military infectious disease hospital. These are Dobers. I think they were probably cousins. I can't confirm that completely. They were from slightly different places on the Burin Peninsula, and some of the information in their file is somewhat incorrect because people mix up when they were tested, mix up some of where they were from. But 6059 Michael Dober was from Burin District. He enlisted August 19th, and he was sent to Channel Port-aux-Basques for guard duty. He returned to St. John's sick and admitted to the Military Infectious Disease Hospital with flu pneumonia and died October 12th, 25 years of age. His body was not allowed to be returned to Burin because he died in St. John's, and therefore, and they didn't want to send infected bodies around as a military regulation, so he was buried in St. John's. Presumably his cousin, again from the Burin area, the Spanish Room, and number only 7 different. Peter Dober, he enlisted the next day, August 20th. He too, at the same time, was sent to guard duty in Channel Port-aux-Basques. He got sick on October 15th and died of influenza in Channel Port-aux-Basques on October 25th. Because of the regulations, his body was not allowed to be moved, and therefore he is buried, and you can see in this gravestone erected by his uncle and aunt, and is buried in Channel Port-aux-Basques. These are just other military groups up here at the top. Seaman with the Naval Reserve died from influenza in Greenwich. Patrick Parrell came home from Scotland, but died of influenza on arriving home and is buried in the Mount Carmel Cemetery. Even the merchant marine, Leo Bungay, had been captured after the sinking of the SS Dictator, was a prisoner of war, and died in Germany, and is buried in Berlin. And Seaman Walter Morey, with the HMS Britain, died in St. John's and is buried in Holy Trinity Cemetery in Torbay. With the epitaph, "He was ready to die that we might live." And again, although all deaths are tragic, this is one of the sad ones. Walter Scammell had originally been with the Newfoundland Regiment, and he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps / Royal Air Force. He was got sick with influenza, and he died November 11th, Armistice Day, 1918, in Cambridge, England. He had a private gravestone initially set up through Reverend Facey, who had been in Change Islands, his home, and then at that time was actually doing further training in Cambridge. He set up a private memorial, and unfortunately, you can see in 1917, it had fallen down, and through the work of the Trail of the Caribou and the help of the Commonwealth War Graves, they've left the cross on the ground, but they have put up a standard Commonwealth War Graves with the Newfoundland. So people in Cambridge know that this is a Newfoundlander. Now, and I'll just mention, before I give the last word to Jesse Brinson, the Versailles Treaty, there is allusions to, with the Versailles Treaty, how it may have been affected with various individuals. So the British Prime Minister had gotten a mild case of influenza in the spring, in April of 1918, But the American President Wilson and Colonel House, his main aide-de-camp and negotiator, they both had influenza during the negotiations and signing of the Versailles Treaty. So whether that affected the negotiations or not, one can always speculate. And Jesse Britton, who was from Carmenville, listed in October 15th, 1918. So just as the war was ending, and you can see how high his number is, he was at Barracks Hospital in November 3rd, 1918. And this just shows you the fear of the pandemic, which is no different than today. And so I'll just read it. I got the Spanish influenza. It was time enough to catch that. I wrote a letter. I had no better sense than to write a letter now and send the disease right in the family, to take the whole lot of them out the one day. Never give it a thought. I wrote father and told him I was in the military hospital with the flu, Spanish flu. And while I was there was 8 soldiers buried, 8 days a soldier buried every day for 8 days. There. Last but not least, there were survivors, many more survivors than those affected by it. And that's a few of the survivors that we found through their records. So, okay, that's my portion done. And let's see.
So much, Ian.
I'll stop sharing. There
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. I guess, John, I'll just jump right into my presentation. Everybody can hear me, right? Okay, right? Yes. I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen, so if anybody has an issue, you'll have to unmute and tell me. So can everybody see my PowerPoint there? Looks good?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation in St. John's and the immediate response of public health authorities to the second wave of the Spanish flu, especially as it pertained to the government commandeering the Grenfell Mission's relatively new building at the time, the King George V Seamen's Institute at the east end of Water Street. The building became ground zero for treating patients during the second wave of the flu in the city and was crucial to the government's public health efforts. By the fall of 1918, local newspapers had been reporting on global outbreaks of the Spanish flu for several months, including reports of the flu in Germany in July, in South Africa in September, in military camps throughout the United States, and in cities throughout Canada. The news was somewhat buried in the newspapers at first because media outlets were still entirely focused on the progress of the war at the time. And of course, as Ian pointed out, the countries involved in the war censored any news about the epidemic, which is why it became known as the Spanish flu. Without censorship restrictions, Spanish newspapers reported the flu first. I'm just going to see if I can change how I'm displaying this, because for the recording, to see if I can get the speaker up. No. Just bear with me for a minute now. No, it's not letting me. Okay, well, everybody can see the main thing is you can see my my PowerPoint. Oops. Okay. So by the fall of 1918, the health authorities in Newfoundland were aware that an epidemic of influenza was circulating the globe, and it was just a matter of time before it arrived on our shores. However, it turns out that the flu had already been in Newfoundland over the spring and summer of 1918. We now know, based on research conducted by anthropologist Lisa Sattenspiel that the first wave of the Spanish flu was circulating in Newfoundland between May and August 1918. Sattenspiel analyzed death records here at the Rooms Provincial Archives and found that although this was a much less virulent version of the flu, it still resulted in 76 deaths from influenza as the primary cause and 115 pneumonia-related deaths. This graph is from Sattenspiel's research. You can see that it was a much smaller wave than the second, but it's clear that there was a first wave of the Spanish flu here in the summer of 1918. Based on analysis of these death records, Sattenspiel dates the start of the second wave at September 10th, 1918, which she argues was the first influenza death recorded after the end of the first wave. So we know that now. But in 1918, the first known cases of the Spanish flu were reported in local newspapers in St. John's on September 30th, when 3 sick seamen arrived by steamer and were transferred to the fever hospital after the steamer had been inspected by the public health officer. On October 2nd, 14 more cases arrived on 2 separate ships, and 2 of those cases were also ordered to hospital, although it's not clear what happened to the other 12 cases. Perhaps they must have remained on board their ships if they did not require hospitalization. It was clear, though, that the government in the fall of 1918 was concerned about the arrival and spread of the flu through ships. There was a strong association between boats and the spread of the disease, as Ian mentioned, both globally and locally, and several ships were quarantined or held in port during the epidemic in St. John's and also in other ports across Newfoundland, specifically Bay Roberts and Port Union. So the ships would be quarantined if there was a sick crew member. More cases of the Spanish flu continued to arrive in St. John's by ship throughout the fall. So the port was somewhat of an Achilles heel for the city and for the island in terms of importing the flu. And indeed, Sattenspiel and her colleagues argue that it is most likely that the second wave entered Newfoundland through St. John's, either through trading vessels or military transport. And this is not unlike today, where we've seen COVID-19 spread through travel. As Ian mentioned, ships in 1918 were the planes of today. In 1918, the flu spread initially globally by ship and then locally, which Terry will show, by coastal schooners and by the train. Basically, the flu moved when people moved, the same as today. As cases continued to increase in the city during the fall of 1918, you can see some rising anxiety in the local newspapers, which reported on new cases every day. Here on, quote, instead of diminishing, the disease, there is any possible thing that the authorities can do, they should do it. After observing the situation and experiences of Canadian cities from a distance and then having cases confirmed in St. John's on October 7th, the local health authorities had recognized that an outbreak of influenza in Newfoundland was imminent, and they met to develop an emergency plan. 2 days later, the public health officer published recommendations on preventing the spread of influenza, specifically highlighting factories, suggesting that foremen watch for signs of flu in their employees, including chills, headache, aches and pains, sneezing, sore throat, fatigue, and fever. Any such employees should be isolated as much as possible. Employees were also warned of the dangers of spitting, sneezing, coughing without using a handkerchief, and these instructions were also applicable to schools and all places of employment. There was no indication about the use of masks as a public health measure in St. John's in 1918. The public health officer also noted that mortality for the disease was alarmingly high, particularly when it attacked the poorer classes who could so ill afford special nursing. By publishing these recommendations, it's clear that the government was aware that some people in the community were more at risk for the disease than others. The poor, for example, who could not afford private duty nursing care if they fell sick. And factory workers did not have the option to not go to work. They had to provide for their families. If they didn't work, their families would starve. There was no employment insurance at the time. There was no social safety net. There was no universal health care. There was no CERB like we have today, which some people can access. And even with today's social programs, this is still something that we hear a lot about in terms of the social discrepancies in experiencing something like an infectious disease epidemic. Infectious disease outbreaks have historically exposed social inequalities, and COVID-19 is exposing the same today. For example, grocery store workers, many of whom are women, don't have the option to work from home and are more potentially exposed to COVID-19 than people who can work from home or people whose place of employment does not include interaction with the general public. Meanwhile, back in 1918, cases of infection continued to increase and cause alarm for everyone. On October 14th, in an attempt to limit the spread of influenza, Dr. Fraser, acting medical health officer, closed all places of public gathering, including the schools, theaters, moving pictures, and concert halls, and other places where people gathered. And on October 18th, Fraser closed all city churches until further notice. In doing so, he referenced the examples of Boston, Montreal, and Halifax that had all closed all public places of public resort. So health authorities in Newfoundland were keenly aware and watching developments throughout the rest of North America at this time. While their focus to this point had been on trying to contain or prevent the spread of the flu, by mid-October, it was clear that the city was quickly running out of hospital space. The General Hospital and the Fever Hospital were both operating at full capacity, as the city was also dealing with a serious outbreak of diphtheria, as well as cases of smallpox, scarlet fever, and typhoid. And there were new cases of influenza reported every day. So I guess the silver lining of COVID-19 is that we don't have to deal with outbreaks of diphtheria, smallpox, scarlet fever, and typhoid. But this is another similarity to COVID-19 today, the risk of overwhelming the healthcare system and resources during an epidemic. I believe the provincial government here in Newfoundland and Labrador last spring came up with a contingency plan for establishing temporary hospitals if we get to the point that where that's required. That was the purpose of converting the King George V Seamen's Institute into a temporary or emergency hospital, to alleviate the pressure on the general and fever hospitals and to provide hospital beds for the hundreds of people who were becoming sick with the flu. The King George V Seamen's Institute was built in 1912 by the Grenfell Mission with significant investment from the Grenfell Association of America in New York. And if you want to know more about this very interesting building, I did an online talk for Happy City St. John's on the history of the building last spring, and there is a link available on our website at www.nlhistory.ca. Although the building was only 5 years old at the time of the epidemic, it had already seen its share of traumatic and notable events. It was converted into a temporary hospital during the Sealing disaster in 1914 and also became a temporary morgue for victims of that disaster. And during the First World War, it was used to accommodate soldiers coming to St. John's from the outports, going to and from overseas. On October 15th, the Grenfell Mission agreed to a government proposal to convert the building into a temporary hospital, and the government took over the institute, placing it under Dr. Fraser's authority. The first step in taking over this building was moving all of the current residents out, and this became a significant cause for concern. The institute was built to offer accommodations to not only fishermen and seamen, but also to the, quote, daughters of fishermen and seamen from the outports who were in the city looking for work. At the time, there were 18 young women who lived on the top floor of the building, which was then called the Girls Department. According to Armine Gosling, who was chair of the Ladies Committee at the Institute, most of these women were from the outports working in St. John's for low wages. Gosling requested that the government consider their situation, and she wrote to the colonial secretary, quote, "It will be a serious hardship to them to have to find other quarters. They have been paying $4 a week at the Institute and could not live anywhere else as cheaply. In addition, as there have been several cases of influenza in the department, they will hardly find anyone willing to take them in under any conditions. On their behalf, I ask that the government should undertake to reimburse them for any increase in the cost of board for them. I have already represented the matter to the acting Prime Minister by telephone. Armin's request was discussed by the Executive Council. However, it was refused, and it's unknown what happened to those 18 women in terms of their living situations at the time. Because the building was taken over for use as a temporary hospital, and the manager of the Institute, Walter Jones, was asked to continue in his capacity as superintendent. I'm pretty sure this is Walter Jones here that I have circled. He was the superintendent of the Institute for the Grenfell Mission. Within 6 hours of the Grenfell Mission agreeing to the government to turn the building into a temporary hospital, he had 1 ward ready to receive cases, complete with the necessary furniture and equipment. And within 24 hours, the Institute had admitted 22 patients. From this point on, the Institute, in its capacity as an emergency hospital, was often referred to as Grenfell Hall Hospital, and I suspect that was because the first ward of 24 beds was actually located in Grenfell Hall, which was the large assembly room on the main floor. And these are a couple of pictures of Grenfell Hall in happier days. It really was the heart of the Institute. It had pictures of the King and Queen on the walls, which were personal gifts to Grenfell. And it was here where all special events took place, lectures and moving pictures. Grenfell Hall Hospital at first had 3 wards, 1 for men of 24 beds, another for men of 12 beds, and 1 for women of 8 beds, which I suspect was on the top floor. Later, it included a convalescent ward, and the billiard and reading rooms and the restaurant were all converted into wards. The cases prioritized at the hospital were seamen first, and then people from the city, especially the most, quote, the most destitute and helpless. There is reference in the newspapers to an entire family being removed from their home on Tessier Place and brought to the hospital for care. By October 17th, there were 32 patients in the hospital and a staff of 6 trained and volunteer nurses, and the Institute announced that it could not admit any more patients without more help. At the end of October and the beginning of November saw the most cases and the most deaths of influenza in St. John's and an increased urgency in public health notices. This one is from October 26th, I believe, and it states that the majority of people did not appreciate the seriousness of the disease, and Fraser wrote, quote, avoid crowds, avoid public gatherings indoors, avoid club rooms with their closed windows and smoky atmosphere, avoid church gatherings. A lot of this is familiar to us today, although perhaps not the club rooms with smoky atmosphere. Fraser also appealed in bold letters saying, stay home from church tomorrow. And then the next day the masses were discontinued. So you can really see the increased urgency in the public health messaging throughout the weeks of October in 1918. Over the course of 9 weeks, from October 15th, when the emergency hospital opened, to December 7th, when it closed, 267 patients were admitted to the Institute, including 47 men and 59 women and children from the city, 41 women from the outports who were working in St. John's at the time, mostly as domestic servants, and 120 fishermen and seamen from the outports and various countries, including England, Scotland, the United States, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Holland, Norway, Russia, the Baltics, Somaliland, and the West Indies. In keeping with the mission's non-denominational policy, Jewish, Lutheran, Greek Orthodox, Baptist, and Muslim patients were all treated at the Institute. Many of the, so these are the numbers, the admission numbers for Grenfell Hall Hospital, and you can see it peaked. It looks like it peaked on November 1st, which is really in line with the trends that we saw in the larger graphs by Sattenspiel. Many of the staff at the Institute who were treated influenza patients became sick themselves, including Nurse Reed and Walter Jones's wife and daughter, who both became sick. All 3 recovered, but there was often a shortage of help at the Institute, and the newspapers had a lot of these notices that they desperately needed more people to help care for the sick. And of course, there were many nurses who did not recover, including Mary Mealy. I don't have a picture of Mary Mealy. I just found a reference to her in the newspaper. She was a nurse at the General Hospital. Bertha Bartlett. So Bertha Bartlett was from Brigus. She was a volunteer aid detachment nurse, and she was treating patients of the flu overseas when she became sick herself and died on November 3rd, 1918. She was just shy of her 24th birthday, and she's buried with the Newfoundland contingent at Wandsworth. So this is Bertha here in the front. The picture on the left is from the Francis Cluett collection at Archives and Special Collections. And this is Bertha Bartlett there in the front. And on the right, this is a picture, I believe I got this one from Veterans Affairs Canada. That's Bertha Bartlett with, over in the UK with some patients and soldiers. Another nurse, Newfoundland nurse who died of influenza was Marjorie Ella Janes. She was a nursing student from Hants Harbor, and thank you, Ian, for bringing her to my attention. I didn't know about her before. She contracted the disease while she was a nursing student in Massachusetts, and she died on October 10th, 1918. She was 20 years old, and her brother had just died 6 months prior to that with the Newfoundland Regiment in France. And of course, Ethel Dickinson, who was assisting with the epidemic at the Siemens Institute when she contracted the virus herself on October 24th, and she died 2 days later. Ethel was beloved in the community. She was a teacher and a volunteer aid detachment nurse overseas during the war. She actually returned home in the summer of 1918 because of fatigue. But then when the call went out for more help at the Institute, she put her name forward, and she volunteered and helped with the sick at the Institute. Then she tragically succumbed to the flu herself. In October 1920, a monument was erected to Ethel, and it's located at Cavendish Square near the coffee shop that Ian mentioned earlier that used to be the military hospital. And this was raised in honor of her sacrifice during the Spanish flu. And she, by all accounts, she was a very giving person, and her own family is reported to have written about her giving nature, and that she was going to undo herself because she was so giving to other people that she put others before herself. And in the end, she really did. Linda White has written a great article about Ethel Dickinson. It's published in the Newfoundland Quarterly, and I can't remember the issue off the top of my head, but I can search it out if anybody would like to know specifically which issue it's in. At the Institute or Grenfell Hall Hospital, including Ethel, 32 people died of influenza between October 15th and December 7th. The Institute was criticized through the rumor mill for this high number of deaths, but clarified that most of the cases admitted there were in very serious condition before arriving, and the patients were well attended by the doctors. It's possible that the worst cases in the city were sent to the Institute rather than the general or the fever hospitals, but I would have to do some more research into this to be able to say for sure if that was the case. But it's clear that taking over the building as an emergency hospital during the influenza epidemic really disrupted the regular business of the Grenfell mission with the Institute. And actually the government compensated the mission in almost $5,000 in lost revenue, and also made arrangements to cover the building's expenses during the time. But the epidemic was also a terrible strain on everybody involved, especially the nurses, who were, quote, almost beaten out by the ordeal, but remained on duty and received high praise in the aftermath of the epidemic. Upon making his final report to the Department of Public Health, Walter Jones expressed his appreciation to the government for placing their confidence in him during the emergency, and he concluded, "I would like in closing to express my deep sense of appreciation of the confidence you were good enough to show in me when on behalf of the government you asked me to take up the work. It has been a sad pleasure the hardest time of my life, and although I am tired and run down, it is in the work and not of it. So this really strikes me because we don't, the Spanish flu, the influenza epidemic of 1918, has been called the forgotten flu because nobody really talked about it after it happened. And it's come to light in more recent years what a toll it took on the healthcare workers at the time who were trying to treat patients who were suffering and dying from this disease. For his efforts, the government provided Walter Jones with a $900 honorarium in January 1918, and the colonial secretary wished that, quote, the wear and tear of that trying period will soon pass, and that you will shortly recover fully from the effects. I believe Jones, his wife and daughter became sick. I thought I read somewhere that he also became sick, but it was definitely a very trying time for him and his family at the Institute. The government also provided Mrs. Davidson, who was matron of the girls' department, with a $200 honorarium in August of 1919, although she had to petition the government herself for this, and the government thanked her for her, quote, willing assistance which she gave at that time. By December 9th, the worst of the epidemic in the city had passed, and all future cases of influenza were sent to the fever hospital so that the Institute could be fumigated and prepared by December 15th to accommodate soldiers returning home from overseas. It's clear that looking back historically on the second wave of the Spanish flu and how it so swiftly hit St. John's and Newfoundland, the emergency hospital established at the Grenville Mission's King George V Seamen's Institute was crucial to meeting the government's public health needs and providing hospital space to patients of the 1918 influenza epidemic. And that's it for me. Thank you so much. I will stop sharing and hand over to Terry. If you're there, Terry.
Mm-hmm. Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Me a nod.
Sounds
Heidi?
good. Yep,
Good.
sounds good.
Okay, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed. So we're out of our home while we're getting some renovations. We've been staying in a wonderful B&B, and up until today, I've had no problems with our internet connection, but it's been glitchy today. So if I have to disappear and come back in, I will, but we'll hold out hope. One correction on production. I've not been at Memorial 40 years. A mere 35, although if you count my years as an undergrad student and a year working as a researcher for the Maritime History Archives, I guess I'm there. So I'm going to try and just fill in try not to repeat too much of what Heidi and Ian have said, but talk about the spread throughout the island of Newfoundland, and again trying to make some comparisons and contrasts with our current situation. Sources I've used a lot of newspaper sources. There's not an awful lot published, actually, surprisingly. Again, it's this forgotten disease. I do, like the others, rely a little bit on Sattenfield's statistics, although, nothing can be certain. I think most people feel that the numbers that we have, both for morbidity and mortality, are probably underreported. So as I've looked at St. John's dailies and newspapers from Harbour Grace, Chillingate, and Corner Brook. I've also looked at some of the records down at the rooms, and a couple of other small qualitative sources that I think add a little bit. So early spreading. Heidi has pointed out that, it's in St. John's in September. So how did it spread? It did certainly spread through the trains, but I think boats were probably more important. Here you see October 8th, October 4th, a couple of notices in the Evening Telegram. These, read boats you see this all the time, and these are, coastal boats of various kinds. So they're leaving, moving around the island, going left for St. John's for Labrador that day. As we know, some of the men who were on those ships who were infected were taken to hospital. Not sure about what happened to the rest of them, whether it was there in St. John's. Also, about 200 men who were on furlough were sent on furlough and told to go home from the barracks on October 4th. So they all left the barracks, went on home to their communities, and it's quite possible that they were carrying the disease with them. The idea that it came into St. John's and then spread elsewhere, I think that was certainly one vector of the disease, and that's one way it happened. But I think it probably could have been coming in at several points, certainly on the West Coast as well. Very quickly, you can see in the newspapers and the government documents reports from quite distant from St. John. So I suspect it's coming in from many points. We often talk about isolated communities, but people moved around a lot for work. Men were coming back from the Labrador at that time. There could have been men coming back from work in Cape Breton. Men from the offshore coming back. People moved around. Midwives moved from community to nearby communities. There certainly were some communities that were more isolated than others, probably more so in the winter. But this idea that people didn't, were cut off from one another and in that way kind of safe, or once they did get hit, there was no hope for them. That's probably exaggerated a little bit. So some communities did do fairly well. So St. Anthony, I'll talk about a little later. Not a lot of disease there, and that's partly because of its distance. But then, as certainly Anne's work on Labrador tells us, and certainly certain other communities, once it got into certain communities, I think part of what made those communities strong in normal times, when they don't have doctors and they don't have a lot of government presence to help them, was cultural, was the fact that people, there was lots of extended families, that people were in and out of each other's homes. The kitchen, as Marilyn Porter told us a long time ago, was not, the door to the kitchen was not the barrier between public and private. It was the door from the kitchen into the parlor that nobody used except for, wakes and weddings. So people relied on one another and worked together, took care of each other when they were sick. This is how people got through. It's how people got through the flu as well. But of course, it's also a way that the flu was spread. So I believe that it probably came to many communities at different times and in different ways. It's kind of like the Capelin and the cod, it struck in different times. So one of the things you can see in the newspapers is that it seems to be waning in one area, and yet it's still quite ongoing somewhere or building somewhere else. And this is from October 14th. So, you have the first cases in September, and this is the middle of the month. And as Heidi said, it's still not, and this is like page 5, I think, it's still, the newspapers are, so you have to really think about the perspective here of what's going on. This is going on, near the end of the war. And war news is, all over the newspapers, much more so even, 2 weeks in. Than the flu. So, talks about an armistice, and every day too, remember, there's not every day, but almost every day, there's casualty lists being published still, and that they're still seeing, people have been, I wouldn't say that they've been becoming inured to death by any means or suffering, but when we talk about the self-isolation and the stress of that, that we've had to stay in our homes for a long time. It's not the same thing then, as Heidi alluded to. They didn't tell people who were well that they had to stay in their homes. You stayed in if you were sick. But people in your household went out because, as Heidi said, otherwise you would starve. And that was the same in the outports. I mean, people had to get food, people had to get fuel, people had to go see to their neighbors and their elderly parents and that kind of thing. But at that point, you know, these people had been self-isolating from a lot of their loved ones for 4 years. So, you know, they were exhausted. I would say many of them were emotionally exhausted before the season started. So some of the, you know, why is it not talked about? Why does it seem to be played down? Why does it seem to have been forgotten? You know, you have to put it in the context of, I think that's what that generation was going through. So again, you see, you know, more boats. This looks like the same one, but it's slightly different. Just, you know, ships moving. Spanish influenza, this is the top part, I think, of a clip that Heidi showed, of the doctors starting to say, you know, it's coming, we got to be ready, going by what's happening in Canada, we should be prepared. And that's certainly a parallel, that there's a lot of interest, and even before this, there have been stories about the flu in different parts of the world, and you know, trying to be prepared and learn some lessons. This quote at the bottom, about nothing more than the usual fall stock of coals, etc. No need to worry. Time enough when we have occasion for it. This story is actually from a column in the Evening Telegram called Harbour Grace News. So this is about Harbour Grace. It was from the position in Harbour Grace. And of course, there are still people well into it, despite the numbers that we're seeing from COVID, who are saying it's just another flu. And of course, then as now, some people do get mild cases and did okay. Many did not. Harbour Grace was one of those places that, you know, relatively good there. A lot of times when it would hit some of these small communities, initially they'd say, I think we're going to be lucky. It's going to be, you know, the mild version. And it was sometimes just a matter of time. So Harbour Grace certainly did not get off super easy. This is from Satin Spiel, and there are certain areas that, these are death rates in the first wave and the second wave by district, by electoral district. And there's certainly a variation, you know, quite a variation. So death in the second wave for 10,000 is the total overall. You know, quite a few places were underneath. Burgeo Lapoil did really well. Other places, the ones that stand out, particularly Fortune Bay, St. George's, and Placentia St. Mary's, that really had seemingly you know, a higher rate of both disease and death. Not any good work yet to explain that. One of the things I would, and I've read a little bit, a few arguments, none of them have totally convinced me that they have it yet. First of all, we have to wonder about reporting. Is it maybe underreported in some areas that don't have a physician, because many of the places didn't, or you know, that the death is attributed to something else. Tuberculosis, as we know, was rampant at the time. So are the statistics even accurate? And then otherwise, you know, I think I would probably myself, if I was going to try to dig further, I'd probably look at what the rates were of pre-existing disease in the areas, such as tuberculosis. Were they higher in these districts? And then finally, socioeconomic factors. But you know, at this point, that's purely speculative, but you can see there is quite a variation. So that it is an area where there could be good new work. And you know, really by the middle of October, it's all over the colony. So this is from mid-October. Reports are coming in from all. This is just the last part. The first part of it is talking about the Grenfell Institute that Heidi talked about, but down toward the end, reports are coming in from all parts of the Dominion, and it's evidence of a widespread epidemic has come upon us very suddenly. I think that's you know, we all felt it was very sudden. Our life changed very suddenly last March, even though we were sort of watching, you know, something's happening in China, and then, you know, something's happening in Europe. You could see it coming, and yet it felt so sudden. So 1 death reported in Melbourne, 3 in exploits, and 1 at Fortune Harbour. October 17th, Placentia already has 200 cases, an average of 1 per family. This note said the young naval reservist who died is Maury, who Ian mentioned. Cupids and ghouls near Brigus, 2 deaths. Notwithstanding numerous cases everywhere, there's a minimum death list, and the doctors take a very optimistic view of the general situation. This is October 17th. So again, that, you know, trying to reassure perhaps, and trying to kind of hope for the best. The Western Star on October 30th, St. George's area on the West Coast was, as I said, hit quite hard. The flu's really underway in Bay of Islands since the last issue. It's alarming. 3 or 4 more dead at Lark Harbour, which is the first place to report a case. You know, they're saying that it's quite extreme in the area. The Essie is the, I think that's covered up at least on my picture. The coastal boat was came down to Curling on Wednesday, and it was, as Heidi said, it was quarantined then because much of the crew was suffering from disease. The Effie was supposed to go on to up the Northern Peninsula and provide mail and supplies up to St. Anthony. So that may be one of the reasons, you know, they kind of lucked out because of some of the problems on the coastal boat. So you can see the importance of how things were spread around. St. George's, the influenza malady has taken a strong hold. 3 deaths have occurred since Saturday, and yesterday it was rumored that 5 deaths had occurred there within 24 hours. The disease has also been spread at Grand Lake and Howley, while at Curling there have been a number of cases, but no deaths to date. So clearly something is going on in that district to have such high death rates. Again, cultural, socioeconomic, pre-existing problems, lack of care, I'm not quite sure why. This is a neat little letter that I found. And this is from a woman writing to her brother. Well, William James, we're having shocking poor weather, raining most every day, and they got the Spanish flu in Newfoundland now. It's a wonderful disease. Anyone who gets it chokes with it. I hear them say that some places they can't keep the graves open fast enough. So some, you know, great Newfoundland description of it is a wonderful disease. So estimates to the 24th of October, 759 cases and 16 deaths all over the country. And so what was the reaction? How did they react to that? In the rooms, I almost said the Colonial Building, I've been around for a long time. At the rooms in the government documents, there's a file of letters and telegrams coming into the government asking for help. Walter Beck of Sound Island writes, "La grippe and pneumonia very serious there at North Harbour. Can you visit these places immediately?" This is to the Colonial Secretary, to Dr. Chisholm. October 31st from Gambo, desperate situation, sickness Middlebrook, Gambo estimates 200 helpless, deaths last 36 hours. No doctor cannot get one, nor suggest anything. That can government send a nurse and doctor by today's train? Have wired Dr. Fraser. Can government send any? It was, you know, there's just these feelings of desperation. You can really hear them in these messages. And Dr. Smith responded, "Sorry, I can't. All I can attend here." So again, very much overworked. Fraser, who was the chief medical officer in St. John's, he resigned in the middle of January. Said he just taking care of his own patients, and I think he was exhausted by the middle of January. And again, going back to what Heidi was saying, you know, and we can certainly see it in some of the largely women medical health officers across the country, you know, the burden on them. This is a report. So they have these are quite neat, and I've not managed to, I've tried putting them together into big tables, but the problem is from week to week, tiny communities appear and then they disappear. There's no consistency. So these are reports for flu the week ending November 28th, 1918. Sagona, 9 deaths. That's in that was a resettled island in Fortune Bay. So you can see that's part of that big cohort in Fortune Bay. St. Mary's, 12 in St. Mary's that week, 628 cases. So there's Harbor Grace, no deaths, but 450 cases. So their assumption that they were going to get off easy was a little bit premature, I think. The flu and regional discontent. So one of the things that we see happening now is, I think, pre-existing tensions have certainly emerged, and part of that is mental health issues with people being stuck in. But I think there is, you know, a lot of suspicion and a lot of fear that some areas are getting more help than others. So the Western Star complained that, you know, they weren't getting, of course, with the kinds of figures that they had, but they still weren't getting the kind of help that was available, for example, in St. John's. You know, so why aren't we getting that? We need a hospital in Bay of Islands. Harbor Grace Standard, right around the same time too, this is a period when, toward the end of the war, the Women's Patriotic Association of St. John's started looking for, let's say, their next project. And they started looking at child welfare, which was indeed in a terrible state in Newfoundland. And it, money from the government. St. John's was looking for money from the government to help support a child welfare movement. And the Harbor Grace Standard was having nothing of it. The mean city, they said there's enough rich people in the city, they just don't want to get taxed. And so why should we have to pay? So you can see some of this regional discontent emerging out of some of the problems with the flu. But there was some response. Influenza, November 22nd, influenza is still serious in St. George's, and at present there are about 30 patients undergoing treatment there at the hospital. At the hospital lately established there, and I've only recently come across this, a supply of linen and other necessaries were sent out by yesterday's express, the order that was the train, the order for the same having been filled in a quick time by the energetic manager of the Grenfell Institute, Mr. W.H. Jones. So it appears that they were actually responding by setting up, you know, a version like the Grenfell Institute, a temporary hospital in St. George's in response. And it would be interesting to know if there were similar ones elsewhere. But, you know, clearly there's a great need there. Recently, I've done some work on the home front in World War I and the conscription issue. And one of the things that the flu did is kind of delay those guys getting off, possibly. All enlistees from the spring recruiting drive and conscripts the conscription came in May 11th. And they were supposed to report to headquarters in St. John's by September. Initially it was delayed. The Minister of Militia had been to Europe and came back and said the regiment's okay right now. They're up to a strength. They're relaxed. They're resting right now, and there's enough people in training in Europe. So we're okay. And he said, since the fishery has been exceedingly backward, they placed all the men on leave until October 15th. And the government there was a lot of unrest over conscription throughout the island, and they were, you know, reluctant to push it too far, although at that point they are making arrests. By October 15th, of course, the colony was in the grips of Spanish flu, and all the leaves were extended for another month, which brought us, of course, to the period after the armistice. So after the armistice on November 11th, the government dropped any pending actions against defaulters and released the few men who had been imprisoned to allow everyone concerned to get back as quietly and as quickly as possible to their ordinary avocation. So I think in the depths of of this epidemic that people were going through, they were going to kind of not push too. So the flu may actually have stopped some of these guys from going overseas. But as Ian pointed out, it didn't necessarily mean that they were safe. There's a second cluster in St. John's in January, and clearly they were pretty worried about that. So there's January 7th. This is from the Evening Telegram, 23 new cases. It seems that another outbreak occurred, 7 in one house in the Battery. Definitely socioeconomic issues there. It's likely that Grenfell Hall will have to be opened again. It's a fever hospital. Even with the removal of diphtheria cases, cannot accommodate the cases reported. And diphtheria, measles are all through the newspapers, all over the colony as well, coming alongside of the flu. Just as right now, we're of course thinking we're coming into flu season and as we're dealing with COVID. But of course we have wonderful things called antibiotics now too, which can help with sort of secondary infections at least. 16 cases and 2 deaths for St. George's still in January. Dr. Anderson, Heart's Content, is attending to patients at Heart's Delight and Greens Harbor. Citizens should know that the disease is highly contagious and failure to report conspicuous illness should be severely punished by the law. So still that same concern that we're hearing now about, don't be afraid to admit that you're ill, but it's actually more, this seems more like a stick than a carrot. And there was, just as there was uneven spread, there's uneven abatement. So January 29th, Evening Telegram is saying, oh, yeah, it's pretty much done in the city, really happy. But the same edition under Harbor Grace News, several cases of influenza reported on the south side and 2 deaths. So as I say, it's very uneven. This is something that I'd like to sort of have towards the end of my talk. This is a very neat little document I found. So we know the school kids got their education interrupted and there's still struggles now, and who knows what's going to happen. And this is from the log of Principal James Norman, who was principal of the school at Coley's Point, which is now part of Bay Roberts. So the 23rd of September, school had opened late because they were worried about a smallpox epidemic among the children. The 16th of October, only 2 scholars present today. The weather being fine, the children were helping their parents dig the potatoes. There's other parts of the log where he says that they were helping with fishery. 18th, health authorities closed the school due to the flu. They reopened on November 11th, but took that afternoon off to celebrate. The 24th of February, he says the school just reopened after the Christmas break due to the flu. So obviously they're having a second wave there, or third wave, or blip. And then they had to close the school several other days through November because of lack of coal or the children forgetting to bring splits just because of the cold. This guy was going all over trying to find coal to heat the school on some days. So, educating the children's schooling was very much interrupted. As it is now. Other kinds of, it's very hard to know outside the big towns how much of the kind of shutdown legislation that we saw in St. John's was carried through. Certainly in some of the bigger areas, the churches were and other kinds of meetings and that were closed down. But in some of the smaller communities, I suspect that there still were small sewing circles and things like that. And then finally, cashing in, that's another thing. People were very interested in cures. They were watching what's going on elsewhere and jumping on any kind of cure, just as we are seeing now, or as we saw certainly in the early days on Facebook, I remember reading somebody said, you know, if you drink lots and lots of water, it'll flush through and the COVID can't take hold of you. And I like to talk about that with my students, because I think they sometimes think, you know, because they were better formally educated than people in the past, they're, you know, they would never be so gullible as to fall for these kinds of things, but it's still around. So you see lots of, you know, miracle cures. Here's a, you know, throat lozenge. That's, you know, no harmful drugs. You can take as much as you want. Probably candy, basically. But it stops Spanish influenza and other infectious diseases from getting through your mouth. So there was lots of that as well. One of the things, again, I really did want to emphasize is that we have to think, oh, one of my favorite cures was a good Madeira wine was suggested in one story. And the other thing that I guess that I can close with is, in addition to realizing that the people who were suffering through this at this time, say without those kind of government supports that Heidi mentioned, in homes that sometimes didn't have indoor plumbing, without the sort of modern communications that we had to even know what's going on. So some communities, you wouldn't be afraid of people coming in because you didn't know what was going on. And living through this long period of war, they were also under prohibition. So, you know, is when we complained that we actually had to like order online to get to the liquor store and go there and pick up our bottle of wine or whatever. They didn't even have that comfort. Thanks.